The wind screamed through the canyon like a living thing, rattling the shutters and shaking the old pine trees that surrounded Ruth Ruiz's small mountain cabin. The storm had been raging for 3 long days, burying the world outside under thick white snow. Every sound was muffled, every shape lost. Only the moaning wind and the lonely creak of the timbers reminded Ruth that she was still alive. Her husband had gone hunting 2 weeks ago. He was supposed to be back by now. Every hour that passed chipped away at her hope. The small fire in the hearth was burning low, and the pile of firewood beside it was shrinking fast. She had been careful with her supplies, burning only what she needed, eating a little less each day, but even her strength was beginning to fail. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and stared out the frost-covered window. The mountains were gone, swallowed by a wall of white. Not a bird, not a shadow moved. The world had turned into a frozen prison. Her cabin was all that stood between her and death. Ruth's eyes stung as she looked around her small kitchen. The shelves that had once held jars of preserved food were nearly empty. Only a few pickled beets and a sack of flour remained. She whispered to herself, just to hear a voice. The silence was too heavy, too endless. Then, through the roar of the storm, came a sound that didn't belong. A pounding. 3 hard knocks against her door. She froze, her heart thudding in her chest. No one could be out there. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and the mountain passes were closed by now. Maybe the wind had thrown a loose branch against the door. She waited, holding her breath. The pounding came again. Louder, more desperate. Ruth's hands trembled as she reached for the heavy wooden bar that locked the door. A deep voice shouted something outside, almost lost in the howling wind. She pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear. Then she heard it, soft, weak, and unmistakable. The cry of a baby. Her breath caught. For one heartbeat, she stood frozen, unsure if her mind was playing tricks on her. But when the cry came again, she didn't hesitate. She lifted the bar and pulled open the door. The wind slammed it back against the wall, snow whipping into the room. And there he was, a giant of a man standing in the blizzard, covered in blood. His beard was thick with ice, his coat torn and stained dark. His pale blue eyes met hers, wild and exhausted. In his arms, wrapped in his own coat, was a tiny bundle that gave a weak cry. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. He took one staggering step forward, then another, and fell to his knees inside her doorway. Ruth dropped to the floor beside him, her heart racing. The man's breath came in ragged bursts, his hands clutching the baby tight against his chest. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You're safe now." He looked up at her as if trying to make sure she meant it. Then, slowly, he lifted the bundle toward her. His lips moved and one word came out, barely more than a whisper. "Please." Ruth took the baby into her arms. The child was tiny, no more than a few weeks old. Its face red from crying. She felt its fast heartbeat against her chest. It was alive, but cold. Too cold. She turned back to the man. His clothes were soaked, his skin pale beneath the blood and dirt. He had deep scratches across his face and hands, like he'd fought off an animal or worse. "Can you stand?" Ruth asked. He nodded weakly. She helped him to his feet and led him to the chair near the fireplace. He sank into it heavily, every movement filled with pain. Ruth threw 2 more logs onto the fire, ignoring the ache of using up her precious supply. The baby whimpered softly in her arms. Ruth hurried to the stove, heating a little milk she'd been saving. She dipped her finger in to test the warmth, then held it to the baby's lips. The tiny mouth latched on eagerly, and Ruth felt a strange rush of relief. "She's beautiful," she murmured. The man opened his eyes, watching her feed the child. "Her name's Emma," he said hoarsely. Ruth looked up. "She's yours?" He nodded. "My daughter." His voice cracked, and he turned away. Ruth didn't ask more. Whatever had brought him to her door, whatever horror he had survived, it could wait. Right now, both he and the baby needed warmth and rest. When Emma had finished, Ruth wrapped her in a dry blanket and laid her in a small basket near the fire. Then she turned back to the stranger. "You're hurt," she said gently. "Let me clean your wounds." He shook his head. "The baby first." "The baby's fine now," Ruth said firmly. "Now, it's your turn." She tore a clean piece of cloth from an old sheet and dipped it in warm water. The man didn't move as she wiped the blood from his hands and face. Up close, he looked younger than she expected. Early 30s, maybe, but with the eyes of someone who'd seen too much. "You're lucky you made it this far," she said quietly. "No one should be out in weather like this." He gave a faint, tired smile. "Didn't have much choice." Ruth wanted to ask more, but she saw the exhaustion dragging him down. His eyelids drooped, his breathing slowing. He was fighting to stay awake. "Rest," she told him softly. "You're safe here." He hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you," he whispered, "for helping us." Ruth smiled faintly. "You'd have done the same." As he drifted into sleep by the fire, Ruth sat beside the basket and watched little Emma sleeping. The baby's tiny fingers curled around the edge of the blanket. So innocent. So fragile. Ruth brushed a tear from her cheek. She had always wanted a child, but fate had never blessed her with one. Now, by some twist of destiny, this little girl had come to her doorstep in the middle of a storm. She looked at the sleeping man. Who was he? What had happened to cover him in blood? And who, or what, was he running from? Outside, the wind wailed like a lost soul, shaking the door in its frame. Ruth shivered and whispered to herself, "Whatever you've brought with you, stranger, we'll face it together." Then she pulled the blanket higher over the baby and turned back to the fire, praying that the storm and whatever darkness it carried would pass before morning. Morning came gray and silent, the storm still raging beyond the cabin walls. Ruth woke to the smell of coffee and the soft crackle of the fire. For a moment she thought she was dreaming. Then she saw him, the stranger from the night before, standing by her stove, pouring steaming coffee into 2 cups. The blood and dirt were gone from his face, replaced by a weariness that spoke of deep sorrow and exhaustion. "I hope you don't mind," he said quietly. "You were asleep, and I thought you could use some warmth." Ruth sat up, her shawl still wrapped around her shoulders. "I haven't had coffee in a week," she admitted, taking the cup he offered. The rich smell filled the cabin, comforting and real. "Thank you." The man nodded, his movements careful and slow. He still favored his left side, the wounds on his ribs making every breath look painful. Ruth's eyes drifted to the basket beside the fire. Baby Emma was awake, waving her tiny hands and making soft sounds. "She's a strong little thing," Ruth said fondly. "Didn't cry once through the night." The man's gaze softened as he knelt beside the basket. "Takes after her mother," he murmured. Ruth hesitated. "Her mother, she's gone?" He nodded once, his jaw tightening. "Sarah died 6 weeks ago, childbirth." Ruth's heart clenched. "I'm sorry." "She was everything to me," he said, still staring at the baby. "After she died, I tried to care for Emma alone, but it was hard. Winter came fast. Food ran out. I planned to take her down to the valley, find a family who could care for her better than I could." Ruth's voice softened, but something happened. He looked up, his pale eyes filled with grief and fury. "A gang, men hiding out in the old mine up the ridge. They didn't want anyone nearby. Said if I didn't leave, they'd kill me and the baby." Ruth's hand went to her mouth. "They threatened a child?" "They burned our cabin," he said, voice low. "I grabbed Emma and ran. That was 3 days ago." Ruth felt her knees weaken. She looked toward the window, where snow still blew in heavy gusts. "You've been out there for 3 days with a baby?" Quote. "I couldn't stop," he said simply. "If I stopped, we'd freeze." For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the storm's moan against the roof. Ruth looked at him again, really looked at him. Beneath the scars and the exhaustion, there was something steady and strong. He wasn't a criminal or a wild man. He was a father who had done the impossible to keep his child alive. "You saved her life," Ruth said softly. He shook his head. No, you did. Ruth smiled faintly but said nothing more. She returned to feeding the baby while he checked the shutters, making sure they were still holding against the wind. His movements were slow but careful, each action deliberate. When he finished, he returned to sit by the fire, rubbing his calloused hands together. I never got your name, Ruth said after a moment. Anthony Watson, he replied. I'm Ruth Ruiz, she said. My husband built this cabin before the war. He's been gone hunting for 2 weeks now. Anthony glanced toward the empty rifle rack by the door. You're alone here? Ruth nodded. For now, but he'll come back soon. Anthony didn't answer. His eyes said he didn't believe it, but he didn't want to argue. Ruth changed the subject. You need to rest. You've done enough work for a man who almost froze to death. He smiled weakly. Resting makes me nervous. I've been running too long. Then fix something, Ruth said, trying to lighten the mood. The shutter by the pantry rattles. Been driving me crazy. Anthony gave a short laugh and stood. A job I can handle. As he worked, Ruth studied him quietly. He was strong, yes, but not reckless. He moved with a kind of quiet patience that reminded her of her late father. Steady hands, thoughtful eyes. The more time she spent watching him, the more she trusted him. By midday, the storm showed no sign of breaking. Ruth made soup from what little she had left. Boiled beans, bits of dried meat, and flour thickened with water. She gave Anthony the larger bowl without hesitation. You didn't eat enough, he said, noticing her half-empty bowl. I'm not hungry, Ruth replied, but her faint smile didn't fool him. He frowned. You're running low on food. It's fine, she said quickly. The storm will end soon. I'll get to town. Quote, Anthony looked at her for a long moment. I shouldn't have come here, he said quietly. I brought danger to your door. You brought a baby, Ruth said firmly, and a man trying to do what's right. There's no danger in that. He stared into the fire. You don't understand. Those men, they don't leave witnesses. When the storm clears, they'll come looking. A cold chill spread through Ruth that had nothing to do with the weather. You think they'll come here? He nodded slowly. If they find this cabin, they'll kill anyone inside. Ruth's voice was steady, though her heart raced. Then we'll be ready for them. Anthony turned to her, surprised. You'd fight them? For us? Ruth met his gaze without flinching. I won't let anyone harm a child, or the man who carried her through a storm to save her life. Something softened in his expression. You don't owe us anything. I'm not doing it because I owe you, she said. I'm doing it because it's right. For the first time since he had arrived, Anthony's shoulders seemed to relax. He looked at Ruth with quiet respect. Sarah would have liked you, he said softly. That night, as the storm raged outside, Ruth laid Emma in the basket beside her bed. Anthony refused the spare room and slept by the fire instead. Before blowing out the lamp, Ruth watched him lying there, one hand resting on the floor near the baby's basket, as if even in sleep he couldn't stop guarding her. Ruth whispered into the darkness, You're safe now, little one. I'll keep you safe. Outside, unseen in the swirling snow, a shadow moved among the trees, a dark shape watching the cabin through the storm. Inside, Ruth and Anthony slept, unaware that the danger he had feared was already closing in. The next morning came with a strange stillness. The wind had quieted, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the storm itself. Ruth stepped outside, boots sinking into the deep snow that reached her knees. The sky was pale gray, the kind that warned more snow could come any moment. But for now, the mountains seemed to hold their breath. She looked toward the valley, her heart aching for the world beyond the white. Somewhere down there was life, warmth, people. Up here, only silence. She turned back toward the cabin, the smoke from the chimney curling weakly into the air. Inside, Anthony sat near the fire, sharpening a hatchet he had found by the woodpile. His face was tight, his eyes distant. Emma cooed softly in her basket, her tiny hands reaching toward the dancing light. "Storm's easing," Ruth said quietly, brushing snow from her shawl. "But it's cold enough to freeze your soul out there." Anthony looked up. "That means they can move again." Ruth frowned. "You really think they'd come looking in this weather?" "They've got nothing to lose," he said flatly. "Men like that never stop, not until they're sure you're dead." Ruth shivered, her hand tightening around the edge of the table. "Then we'll make sure they don't find us easy." Anthony gave her a look, part disbelief, part admiration. "You've got more grit than most men I've known." Ruth managed a small smile. "I've lived through storms before. This one just happens to have a name and a gun." He gave a faint chuckle, but the sound didn't reach his eyes. He went back to checking the rifle Ruth's husband had left behind. There were only a handful of bullets, not nearly enough if the outlaws really came. By midday, the quiet outside felt wrong, too still. Ruth could sense it in her bones. The mountain wasn't calm, it was waiting. She fed Emma another bottle and tried to keep her hands from shaking. Anthony moved to the window and froze. "Ruth," he whispered. "Someone's out there." Her breath caught. She joined him, peering through the frost. Dark shapes were moving among the trees, slow and deliberate. 4, maybe 5 men. The glint of rifles flashed between the branches. "They found us," she breathed. Anthony's face hardened. "Get Emma. Go to the root cellar under the kitchen. Don't come out until it's over." "Anthony, you can't fight them alone." He gripped her arm. "If they find you and the baby, they'll kill you both." "Please, Ruth, go." There was something in his voice that left no room for argument. Ruth ran to the basket, scooping Emma into her arms, wrapping her tightly in a blanket. The baby whimpered softly, sensing the fear in the air. The first shot shattered the quiet. Glass exploded from the window, spraying across the floor. Anthony dropped low and returned fire through the broken frame, the crack of the rifle echoing through the cabin. "Go," he shouted. Ruth lifted the trapdoor to the cellar and climbed down, pulling it shut above her just as boots thundered onto the porch. She crouched in the dark, holding Emma close, whispering prayers into her soft hair. Above, she heard voices, rough, mocking. "Well, well," one man drawled. "The mountain man and his brat. You gave us a nice chase, Watson." Anthony's voice came steady, strong. "There's no one here but me." Laughter followed. Then the sickening sound of a blow. Ruth covered her mouth to stifle her gasp. "Don't lie to us," another voice snarled. "We saw the smoke. You're feeding someone." "Where's the woman?" Anthony groaned in pain, but his voice didn't waver. "There is no woman, and the baby's dead." Quote. Ruth's heart broke at the lie, but she understood what he was doing. He was protecting them, even now. "Check the place," the leader ordered. "If he's lying, kill them all." Ruth heard boots stomping, furniture breaking, drawers thrown open. Then the steps moved closer, toward the kitchen. She clutched the shovel she'd found in the darkness, her knuckles white. Above her, the floor creaked. A board shifted. "Hey, boss!" A man called. "There's something under here." Ruth's pulse hammered. Emma whimpered softly. She pressed her hand over the baby's mouth, praying she wouldn't cry. "Open it," the outlaw said. The trapdoor began to lift. Then suddenly, a rifle cracked. Another shot followed, then another. "Lawmen!" someone shouted. "It's the sheriff!" Gunfire erupted, wild and chaotic. Ruth crouched low, holding Emma as the cabin shook with violence above her. Voices screamed, boots thudded, and then silence. For a long moment, Ruth didn't move. Her ears rang from the gunfire, her heart thudding so hard she thought it might burst. Then a voice called her name. "Ruth! Ruth, it's me!" She froze. It was her husband's voice. With shaking hands, she pushed open the trapdoor. Her husband stood in the doorway, snow clinging to his coat, rifle in hand. Behind him were 2 deputies, guns still smoking. "Thank God," he said, pulling her into his arms. "When we saw smoke and heard the shooting, we came running." Ruth clung to him, tears spilling down her cheeks. "They were here. They would have killed us." He looked over her shoulder toward the fire. Anthony was sitting against the wall, blood on his face but alive. "He fought like a man with something worth dying for," her husband said. "We owe him our lives." Anthony gave a tired nod. "No, you owe me nothing. Ruth saved us first." Ruth walked to him, still holding Emma. "You saved her," she said softly. "And me." He looked at the baby in her arms, his eyes glistening. "Sarah would have wanted her safe. You made that happen." Ruth's husband stepped forward, extending a hand. "You've got a place here if you want it. Any man who'd face death for a woman and a child is family in my book." Quote. Anthony hesitated, then took his hand. "I don't know where else to go." "Then stay," Ruth said simply. "Stay with us. Emma needs a family, and so do you." For a long moment, Anthony said nothing. Then he nodded, his voice rough. Sarah would have liked that. Outside, the storm had finally broken. The clouds thinned, revealing the first stars over the mountain peaks. The snow sparkled in the moonlight, clean and untouched, as if the land itself was beginning anew. Ruth sat by the fire later that night, Emma asleep in her arms, Anthony beside her. The cabin was battered, the windows shattered, but the danger had passed. Her husband was alive, the outlaws were gone, and for the first time in months, she felt safe. Anthony reached out, brushing Emma's tiny hand with his finger. The baby's fist curled around it, strong and certain. "She's going to be all right," he said quietly. Ruth smiled. "We all are." The fire crackled, warm and steady. Outside, the night was calm, the mountain at peace once more. The man who had arrived, covered in blood with a baby in his arms, had found more than shelter that night. He had found a home. And Ruth, who had opened her door to strangers in need, had discovered that sometimes the greatest gifts come from the storm itself.